Due to my habit of finding employment in low-status, manual work, I have for a long time been spared direct contact with the inclusion bureaucracy. The appetite for equality is relatively weak here because the work is hard, poorly rewarded, and those who carry it out have virtually no ability to influence the power structure whatsoever. The ambitions of the average activist are focused on equality in high-status professions, and there are thus few feminists leaning in to labouring jobs on building sites. From the perspective of the regime, there are much more pressing strategic concerns than ensuring, for example, that the digging of holes becomes less transphobic. But over time, the tendrils of power have slowly penetrated all aspects of this world, bringing with them mission statements and pledges. It is no longer sufficient for the tarmac to be laid flat. The laying of the tarmac must also represent a comprehensive commitment to climate justice. Observing this trend, I knew my days of innocence were numbered. On a recent contract, the moment finally came. My first interaction with inclusion was as strange and paradoxical as I imagined it would be. I was invited, via email, to attend mandatory training. I was not commanded to attend, but rather presented with an invitation which could not be refused. This example of indirect power projection activated within me an analytic mood, and I decided to spend my time at the pleasure of the managerial elite studying the particular mode of managerial power called inclusion training. The term managerial power refers to the form of power which is expressed through the control of technical systems of production. Whereas feudal power was exerted through the control of land and titles, and capitalist power through the control of private property rights, managerial power is projected through control of the managerial systems required to operate the modern industrial environment. The rise of managerial power is charted by James Burnham in his book, The Managerial Revolution. Quote, "Changes in the technique of industry have, on the one hand, reduced more and more workers to an unskilled, or close to unskilled, category, but, on the other, have tied the process of production more and more critically to certain highly specialised skills, of engineering, production planning, and the like, requiring elaborate training not possessed by, or available to, many workers. The workers could not, by themselves, run the productive machine of contemporary society." End quote. Whilst this managerial expression of power may exhibit superficial differences from what went before, the underlying character of power was not modified in the transition. Quote, "The existence of a minority ruling class, it must be stressed, is a universal feature of all organised societies of which we have any record. It holds no matter what the social and political forms, whether the society is feudal or capitalistic, or slave or collectivist, monarchical or oligarchical or democratic, no matter what the constitutions and laws, no matter what the professions and beliefs." End quote. Burnham quotes the Italian elite theorist Gaetano Mosca, describing the mechanism by which power retains its essential character. "The power of any minority is irresistible as against each single individual in the majority, who stands alone before the totality of the organised minority. At the same time, the minority is organised for the very reason that it is a minority. 100 men, acting uniformly in concert with a common understanding, will triumph over 1,000 men who are not in accord, and can therefore be dealt with one by one. Meanwhile, it will be easier for the former to act in concert and have a mutual understanding, simply because they are 100 and not 1,000. It follows that the larger the political community, the smaller will be the proportion of the governing minority to the governed majority be, and the more difficult will it be for the majority to organise for reaction against the minority." End quote. The concept of inclusion refers, in this regard, to a system of human resource management which partially determines who is in the workplace and which mediates their interactions with one another. The organised minority, who dictate the precise formulation of this system, exert managerial power over the disorganised majority who are subject to its implementation. The power of the manager expands in proportion to the further propagation of the system, both in terms of breadth, i.e., increasing the number of social structures subject to inclusion management, and in terms of depth, i.e., increasingly comprehensive and intrusive management of thoughts and behaviour. As staff lose the ability to interact with each other independently, the power of the inclusion managers increases. It is therefore in the interests of these managers to undermine the ability of workers to relate to each other in an organic fashion, and to introduce a synthetic system of managed interactions dictated from above. As we have seen, in the modern industrial environment, there are numerous critical systems which must come under managerial control, and this fact explains the dominant position held by managers within the existing power structure. But there are also systems which can come under managerial control. Such unmanaged or undermanaged systems present a strategic quandary for managers. Left to their own devices, they may germinate rival political formulae, or more likely, rival interpretations of managerialism. As such, there is a clear incentive for existing managers to assimilate these systems, either through competition or collusion. In a sense, anything that can be managed must be managed, because power left unconquered may be utilised by rivals. The principle holds even when the implementation of management makes the system objectively less efficient from the perspective of production. This is paradoxical, because the initial justification of managerial power is the need for managers to handle the complex processes of industrial production. If they don't increase productive efficiency at some higher level of organisation, such interventions can only be justified on the basis of their ability to support the existing power structure. A managerial system which excessively neglects productive efficiency is at the risk of destroying the foundation upon which its dominion is predicated, the complex productive process which demands management in the first place. Despite all this, one must not overlook the confounding success of the management by crisis model which dominates the modern West. As we lurch from one disaster to another, the resulting disruption is used as justification for further management. This extension of managerialism emerges in response to problems routinely created by management itself. Remember, we are ruled by managers. Therefore, the ultimate responsibility for the failures of governance must lie with them, because they have the power to govern, and we do not. But a perverse incentive exists within the hierarchy. In a sense, the less efficient management is, the more of it we require. One can consider this a kind of organisational tension between different aspects of the productive process. The efficiency of the production itself and the managerial load implied by the complexity of the production. Ideally, from the perspective of the managers, both of these factors would increase simultaneously, but productive efficiency and managerial load may also find themselves in tension, threatening the rule of the managers. Such tension is at the heart of inclusion management and can be observed in the managerial architecture laid out in the inclusion training received. Quote, "Respect in the workplace comes from the law, and it comes from our policies. It is the policy that we hold you accountable to." End quote. As citizens of a defined territory, employees are naturally subject to legal compliance. They must obey the law of the land. But this extensive managerial structure is apparently insufficient and must be augmented with an extra legal policy framework dictated by the inclusion bureaucracy. Unsurprisingly, much like the law, quote, "policies apply outside of work, including online," end quote. From the perspective of the inclusion managers, you are never not at work. What we have here is a situation in which authority is somewhat overdetermined, insofar as workers are governed by two overlapping managerial systems. The presence of this redundant architecture has nothing to do with the immediate productive efficiency of the operation, quite the opposite in fact, but rather serves to promote the organisational technique of management itself. It is of critical importance in this regard that the structures are not strictly parallel, but rather that policy is superior to law. If an employee had committed a crime in the workplace, then the firm would have no problem appealing to the authority of law. Though such an event would almost certainly represent a simultaneous policy violation, the explicit legal infraction could easily become the primary justification for disciplinary action, because the legitimacy of law rests upon a relatively firm, objective foundation, backed by direct force, upon which to anchor such a process. The inclusion managers, experts in indirect power as they are, will happily recruit the law to exert direct force on their behalf. But crucially, by placing policy above law in the organisational hierarchy, the firm reserves the right to apply policy, even in cases where the law has not been broken. For this hierarchical relationship to hold, the policy must be differentiated from the law in some regard. This is achieved through the introduction of subjective interpretations of harm. These are prioritised to such an extent that the policy structure becomes totally divorced from an objective standard of law. In reference to the complaints procedure, it is stressed that, quote, "You don't have to have any evidence. We just ask that you believe in your concern." End quote. In order to activate the inclusion bureaucracy, it is not necessary for the complainant to demonstrate that something has happened. It is sufficient that the complainant feels that something has happened, a point that was reiterated on several occasions during the training. One may argue that this stance protects actual victims in circumstances where evidence is not forthcoming, and this is true, but it also exposes the disciplinary process to abuse. Such conditions allow for vindictive and fabricated claims to be made against the innocent, for whom an objective standard of judgment would afford a much greater level of protection. This ethical dilemma is perennial, but it must not distract us from a hazard of the deep kind. The power structure may itself exploit this vulnerability for its own benefit. Those with power, in this case managers, have status. This status induces two heuristic responses in the masses: a positive bias towards authority and a negative fear of power. These are primal psychological impressions which sustain, to a certain degree, the power relations described by Burnham and Mosca. Even to have been investigated is to arouse suspicion. One becomes the sort of person who the inclusion team has to investigate. Without the ritual of an objective exoneration, such an individual will become morally tainted, no smoke without fire, or at least dangerous to associate with, fear of being next. In the absence of an objective standard, the managers may pursue investigations selectively, favouring those made by individuals whose presence in the workplace upholds existing power, and ignoring those from potential challengers. Obviously, this enables them to remove or suppress their rivals, but it is worth emphasising a more subtle point here. An investigation need not result in any particular disciplinary conclusion in order for the expansion of managerial power to occur. Even if the accused is left unmolested, the fact that the complainant feels unsafe is evidence that the workplace is unsafe. As the wardens of this kind of workplace safety, the inclusion team will interpret this set of circumstances as an invitation to increase the intensity of management. They will demand further influence in order to fulfill their duty in this regard. When an investigation may be initiated with a claim as tenuous as, "I feel that X is prejudiced against me because I have Y characteristic," the scope for managerial power to impose itself is enhanced to an extraordinary degree. The loss of this objective standard weakens the position of unfavoured workers, who are now entirely subject to the whim of the power structure. For the inclusion managers, it is absolutely essential that subjective is superior to objective. The structure of this relationship differentiates policy from law, which legitimizes the existence of policy. It also provides an access point through which power may be expressed. But the promotion of subjectivity creates a problem for the managers. If subjectivity is primary, then the complainant may initiate proceedings with nothing more than a belief that they have been offended or discriminated against. Then the accused may respond to this claim with a subjective defence. They will argue that it wasn't their intent to offend or discriminate against the complainant, and that therefore no offence or discrimination has taken place. Without an objective standard against which to judge the competing claims, subjectivity of intention neutralises subjectivity of impact. In order to maximise their power, the inclusion managers must resist the introduction of a policy framework based upon objectivity. A purely objective system is undesirable, because in this scenario, the inclusion bureaucracy can only supervise some higher principle beyond its own determination. This reduces managerial power to a limited administrative function, in which it enforces a law superior or equivalent to its own policy, resulting, at best, in a formulation of policy equals law, rather than the preferred policy is superior to law. But by the same token, a purely subjective schema negates the need for managerial power to intervene, as there exists no formal standard against which events are to be judged. Why would some sort of central authority be required if all things are subjective? Only in the mixed environment can managerial power of this sort be propagated without impediment. It is not a surprise, then, that we are informed that, quote, you must be aware of both subjective and objective offence. We must revise the prior formulation. It is not the case that the subjective is superior to the objective. In fact, the subjective is superior to the objective, except when the objective is superior to the subjective. The true power of the inclusion manager is in the determination of which of these standards of truth is to be applied in any given situation. In a sense, what we have here is a Schmittian state of exception, but in a permanent and institutionalized form. Subjective is superior to objective, except when objective is superior to subjective. One such case is the treatment of intent and impact, to which we referred previously. The subjectivity of intent is forever somewhat beyond the reach of the managerial structure. It lies within the mind of the accused. Managerial power cannot allow this state of affairs to limit its access into workplace interactions. Strategically, then, impact must be given primacy over intent within the architecture of the policy. This is made explicitly clear in the training. Impact is superior to intent. From this position, the inclusion team may respond to subjective claims of impact, or they may choose to impose an objective judgment of impact. The objective standard of judgment, we are informed, is, quote, would a reasonable person find this offensive? End quote. What counts as a reasonable person? The answer is perfectly clear. A reasonable person is, in this instance, an inclusion manager. This point was demonstrated in the most remarkable fashion some time later. Having first correctly pointed out that an individual may take offence without displaying outward signs of being offended, the instructor then went on to announce, in an extraordinary moment, even if you think you are unoffended, you may still be offended. What this means is that in a situation in which no one is offended, the inclusion manager may summon an objective standard of offence and impose it onto participants, claiming that these participants are in fact offended, even though they don't realise it themselves. The level of intrusion represented by this claim is staggering. It is, quite simply, totalitarian in nature. In the process of escaping the trap of the subjectivity of intent, the inclusion managers have bestowed upon themselves the power to overrule the internal mental states of workers. Not only have the workers been stripped of a transparent, objective framework within which to operate, they now discover that their subjective reality is subordinate to managerial interpretations. Such psychological destabilization is designed to foster a culture of uncertainty, submission, and prophylactic self-reporting. A further benefit here is that impact need not be limited to the target or victim. Intent has a defined point of origin, but impact is not a singular destination. An in-joke may be overheard by an outsider. A poorly conceived tweet may offend literally millions of people. Any of these individuals may petition the inclusion bureaucracy, or as we have seen, the inclusion bureaucracy may decide to petition themselves. This enables managerial power to intermediate interactions, even when there is no problem between participants. By reserving the right to recruit the bystander, the scope of managerial power is substantially increased. With this established, the instructor warned us that we must always consider the context when interacting with our colleagues. This is basic common sense, which likely predates managerialism by at least several 100,000 years. One does not require formal managerial training in order to understand context. In fact, the imposition of such training tells us a lot about the context of the modern workplace and how it has been modified by the rise to power of the managerial ruling class. Consider the mechanics of an actual investigation. Visualize the meeting that will result from a complaint. Cringe at the prospect of a mildly racist joke being read out in a nondescript office full of inclusion managers, all incentivized to decontextualize the events, declare them offensive, and manufacture a crisis out of nothing so that managerial power can resolve it. By decontextualizing an interaction and placing it into the framework of an inquiry, it necessarily takes on a different character. The bureaucratic solemnity of the process is incompatible with the organic vitality of the moment in question. Passion, personal history, cultural particulars, tiredness, all of these human considerations are crushed by the managerial system and the demands it places on interactions, all of which must conform to its own limited standards. Nothing organic can survive this transportation. As the productive process becomes so complex that it cannot operate without a specialist managerial class, traditional hierarchies are denatured and replaced with synthetic managerial structures through which power is expressed by managers. Previously, if there was a conflict in the workplace, one had a number of options on how to respond. An attempt could be made to diffuse the tension and arrive at a reconciliation. Failing this, one could ultimately decide to leave. Meeting the challenge could take a number of forms: outworking or outfoxing the opponent, verbal confrontation, even physical confrontation. But such independent actions are antithetical to management because they imply that unmanaged events can occur. A reconciliation not consecrated by the inclusion team is suspect. There is no guarantee that the proper procedures were followed, and the idea of two individuals resolving their differences through a contest of force is completely beyond the pale from a managerial perspective. God forbid, these people may get a taste for it and attempt to seize power. Taking a step back from the microcosm of the workplace, we can see that managerialism incrementally disarms the population, both physically and psychologically, so that they may be more easily managed. They are domesticated to such an extent that the French President Emmanuel Macron may claim that he is, quote, opposed to self-defense. You may only be defended by the managers. Independent conflict resolution and the application of direct force run contrary to the interests of managers. These techniques are suppressed, while the use of indirect power is institutionalized. It is no accident that the sole form of power permitted within the system is of the indirect variety, as this is the mode through which the managerial structure prefers to operate. Direct force is only sanctioned in two specific circumstances. Firstly, when the results of that force increase managerial load, and secondly, when the managerial structure has exhausted all avenues of indirect power and must reluctantly employ direct force itself. The infrequency of this secondary form is testament to the skill with which the managerial elite has refined its control over the population, oftentimes through the tacit endorsement of direct force from its own client groups. When BLM burns down dozens of cities in America, we are instructed to get down on our knees. Every managerial institution proudly displays the black fist. When Islamic terrorists blow up a pop concert in Manchester, a choreographed rendition of Don't Look Back in Anger is performed for the cameras, with the resulting footage reconstituted into palliative tolerance porn by the BBC. In the aftermath, the managerial structure takes the opportunity to introduce enhanced security measures against the entire population, and tasks itself with cleaning up the mess, further increasing managerial load. But by comparison, anyone attempting to use direct force in a non-approved fashion is slandered and delegitimized. No consideration of their perspective is required, because ultimately they stand against the regime. The ideological smearing of these radicals disguises the fact that it is power that they threaten, not ideology. The hierarchy is thus selected on the basis of one's ability to appeal to the managers. He who is better at this wins. By the same token, the managers are selected on the basis of their ability to create dependency on managerial power. There is little doubt that this dependency emerged in relation to the complexity of the industrial process. The second and more controversial claim is illustrated here, that a perverse incentive exists whereby managers may prefer increased managerial load over increased productive efficiency. To return to the specific subject of this essay, the inclusion bureaucracy selects for those with protected characteristics. The very phrase protected characteristics implies the existence of a protector. That protector is, of course, the inclusion bureaucracy. The increased managerial load associated with facilitating protection reinforces the power of the managers. But this reality is disguised. Managerial load is ignored entirely, and the legitimacy of the structure is predicated upon a fabricated claim about productive efficiency. We are informed that, quote, a protected characteristic is a characteristic that does not prevent you from doing the work, end quote. It is implied that a morally illegitimate power structure exists. Within this structure, individuals without protected characteristics suppress and exclude those with protected characteristics, even though those with the protected characteristics are equally capable of performing the work. In this way, those with protected characteristics are unfairly discriminated against. In order to support this conclusion, one must commit to a theory of material equality which simply does not correspond to reality. It is plainly obvious that individual differences exist, and that there are average differences between groups. Unsurprisingly, these differences have an impact on productive efficiency. If this were false, then the characteristics in question would not need to be protected. A perfect example of this state of affairs is highlighted by Morgoth in his video Neoliberalism and the Ballad of Terry Bell, in which he describes the introduction of safe carrying protocols at a local company. The maximum carry weight was calibrated around the physical capabilities of a woman, and so the men, who had previously been able to carry much more, found that the extra productive efficiency afforded by their innate physical strength had been written off by the company. The management would then be obliged to enforce the reduction in productive efficiency in order to ensure that the workplace remained inclusive. What this sleight of hand disguises is the fact that those with protected characteristics are actually preferred by the managers because they increase managerial load, even though they may actually reduce the productive efficiency of the operation. Managers adjust the parameters of work in order to accommodate protected characteristics. More individuals with these characteristics enter the workplace. These individuals are more dependent on managerial power, and thus managerial power is reinforced. The most valuable category of such workers are those who are particularly adept at recruiting managerial power. The activist type, who will self-police the work environment and seek out offence as a matter of ideological fervour and/or naked ambition. These individuals act as conduits through which managerial power can propagate itself further into the workplace. This continues until the workplace is saturated to such a degree that no interaction can take place without some form of managerial mediation, be it extrinsic, i.e. part of the formal structure, or intrinsic, internalised by the participants. Even a joke about the absurdity of managerial power reinforces managerial power. Many will think primarily of ideology when considering the concept of inclusion. They may believe that there exists a moral imperative to be more inclusive, and that power must be utilised to realise this ideological claim. This is unsurprising, as a central pillar of the mythology of inclusion is the idea that power itself is to be somehow redefined in a manner coherent with the ideology. Through inclusion, we are told, historical power imbalances are to be resolved. In their place will emerge a system of equity, one which resembles the ideological claims of those through whom it is realised. But for Burnham and Mosca, this is incorrect. Ideologies come and go. Political formulae are adopted and discarded, but power never changes. The ideology of inclusion exists to support the current managerial incarnation of power. It is part of the formula by which the organised minority exerts power over the disorganised majority. This structure is perennial. It existed before managerialism. It lives within managerialism, and there is every indication that it will persist after managerialism has faded from historical memory. If one accepts the facts of the matter as they are, then one must first consider inclusion from the perspective of power, in the process relegating ideology to a subordinate role. From this disposition, inclusion takes on a rather different character. Far from representing an advanced system of power relations, which has been cleansed of the abuses of the past, inclusion becomes just another candidate by which the eternal condition of power may be reproduced. All that changes is which particular organised minority is in power and how they hold on to it. Power is superior to ideology. Those who have the luxury of thinking only in terms of ideology have not yet come into conflict with power. They either benefit from the power structure or endorse it, consciously or unconsciously. When they facilitate the reproduction of the ideology, they cannot help but reproduce the power structure that lurks within, because the ideology is part of the formula by which the organised minority retains power. It is worth reiterating that this is precisely the same sort of power structure that the ideology claims to oppose. Power, by its very nature, is unequal. An imbalance of power is the literal definition of power. Quote, "Nor have the managers themselves been constructing and propagating their own ideologies. This has been, and is being, done by the most part by intellectuals, writers, philosophers. Most of these intellectuals are not in the least aware that the net social effect of the ideologies, which they elaborate, contributes to the power and privilege of the managers, and to the building of a new structure of class rule in society. As in the past, the intellectuals believe that they are speaking in the name of truth and for the interests of all humanity." End quote. Whilst the ideology is centred around a concept of inclusion, the subtext of power is the suppression of any kind of organic difference, which may challenge the uniform technical system imposed by the managers. The ideology is secondary to this law of power. Managerialism selects against those who are adept at operating independently of managerialism, because they suppress the propagation of managerial power. If such individuals will not submit to managerial mediation, then they must be excluded and ostracised. The managers will push rivals with unprotected characteristics to the fringes in favour of loyal clients or those willing to bend the knee. This selective exclusion is framed in moral and ideological language, but ultimately serves to reinforce power in its present form. At any moment, the ideology may be modified if the logic of power demands it. Previously favoured groups may find themselves threatened with exclusion as their characteristics become suddenly unprotected. We began this essay with a paradox, that of the mandatory invitation. By the perennial laws of power and an accident of nomenclature, we shall end it with another. Exclusion is superior to inclusion. Only one reference was made in the entire training to the application of direct force, and it arrived right at the end, rushed through like the terms and conditions for a payday loan commercial. Anyone falling foul of the inclusion policy, we were told, will be disciplined, up to and including termination. Exclusion is a fundamental process for any group. By their very nature, all groups are exclusive. The managers, as the ruling class, have control of this process. Managerial power excludes subjects who do not comply with the ideology, and by extension, the power structure. It protects only those who reinforce its legitimacy. This is entirely rational. Managerial power seeks to secure itself by excluding threats. It disguises this process with a post hoc ideological appeal to the concept of inclusion, a delicious irony to which one can only respond with a hearty chapeau. Like all power structures, managerialism must cultivate the environment in which it operates. It must sustain the material conditions most suitable for its propagation. And it must protect the mythology which legitimizes this process. Organic systems are to be audited, quantified, and regulated. The ideology is thrust into every crevice of the public psyche. Threats are removed. The ultimate form of this principle is manifest in the exclusion of productive workers who resist managerial mediation, for in this regard, managerial load is preferred over productive efficiency. The future of managerial power will rest heavily upon this tension and the ability of the managers to marshal it. As Burnham says, changes in the technique of industry have, on the one hand, reduced more and more workers to an unskilled or close to unskilled category. Thus far, the managerial regime has had a great deal of success in dousing the potential of its workers and forming them around the machine. efficiencies at scale have consistently outweighed the losses in capability incurred at an individual level, and the palpable increase in managerial power is testament to this. But beyond any moral considerations about the dehumanization inherent in this sacrifice, or the spectre of limited resources, one has to ask how far this process can be pushed, and whether the exclusion of talented but ideologically suspect individuals will produce a rival power structure. If the pursuit of managerial load excessively degrades productive efficiency, then the foundation of managerial power will collapse, and there will be others waiting in the wings, ready to form another structure of power, much like the last, and yet somehow different.